The couch was not the worst part. Miriam Caldwell had slept on worse things in her life. She had slept on a cot at a church mission in the winter of 1987 when she and Gerald were just starting out and the apartment they had rented smelled of mold and the heat had gone out for 11 days in February. She had slept sitting up in a hospital chair for 3 nights when Gerald had his first surgery, the one on his hip, the one the doctors said was routine and took 4 hours longer than it was supposed to. She had slept on a folding bed at her sister Carol's house in Knoxville the summer the pipes burst at their own place and the remediation took 6 weeks. She was not a woman who required comfort in the way of someone who had never learned to do without it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. But the couch at her daughter Patrice's house in Clarkston was a particular kind of uncomfortable. And it was not the cushions or the length of it or the way the armrest hit at exactly the wrong point on her shoulder if she turned in the night. It was the kind of uncomfortable that lives below the physical, the kind that settles in your chest and stays there and has nothing to do with the couch itself and everything to do with what it means to be sleeping on it. Miriam was 73 years old. She had been sleeping on her daughter's couch for 11 days. She had moved there with 1 suitcase and a cardboard box. The suitcase held her clothes, 4 changes of them, the photograph of Gerald that had lived on her nightstand for 41 years, the small wooden box with the pearl earrings her mother had given her on her wedding day, and her Bible with the loose pages in the back that she had been meaning to have rebound for years. The cardboard box held her papers. The deed to the house on Calloway Street. The insurance documents. The records of Gerald's pension. The records of her own pension. The smaller one from the 22 years she had worked as a billing coordinator at Hargrove Medical Associates before they had been absorbed by a larger system that did not need her particular position. The papers that described, with the flat factual clarity of official documents, the shape of her life and what it had been worth. The house on Calloway Street was no longer hers. This was the fact she was still learning to carry. The way you learn to carry something heavy by discovering through the process of trying that it is heavier than you expected. She had lived in that house for 38 years. She and Gerald had bought it in March of 1986, the year their son Dwight was 3 and Patrice was 6, the year Gerald had gotten the promotion at the plant that meant they could afford something with a yard. She had painted the kitchen herself, twice, and had planted the azaleas along the front walk that had come back every spring without fail, and had replaced the windows in the back bedroom when the seals went in 2003, and had refinished the floors in the living room the year after Gerald died because she needed to do something with her hands and the floors had needed it for a long time. The house had been hers. Her name was on the deed alongside Gerald's, had been there since 1986, the 2 of them side by side in the county records, and when Gerald died 4 years ago it had become hers alone, which was not the way she had wanted it. Was not a form of ownership she had sought, but was what it was and she had continued in the house because the house was where 41 years of her life lived in the walls and the floors and the azaleas she had planted along the front walk. Then Dwight had come home. Dwight had been living in Atlanta for 14 years, which was long enough that the way he lived there had become more real to him than the way he had grown up here, or at least that was what Miriam told herself when she tried to understand how he had become the person he had become. She did not say this out loud. She had learned over years of being a mother that there were certain understandings you kept to yourself not because they were wrong but because saying them would close a door that you were not yet ready to close. She still loved her son. She understood that love and clarity about a person were not the same thing and did not always arrive together. Dwight had come home in April, 8 months before Miriam found herself on Patrice's couch, and he had come with a plan, which he had presented at the kitchen table on Calloway Street with the focused energy of someone who has been developing an idea for some time and is ready to deliver it. The plan involved the house. It involved, specifically, a refinancing that would allow Dwight to access the equity that had accumulated over 38 years and that represented, in Dwight's accounting, a resource that was sitting unused when it could be working. He had figures. He had printed them on paper in columns, the way he had seen done in presentations, and he had laid the pages on the kitchen table with the confidence of someone who has mistaken preparation for wisdom. Miriam had listened. She was a woman who listened before she spoke, who had found over 73 years that the space between hearing something and responding to it was where most of the useful thinking happened. She had listened to Dwight's plan and she had asked questions and she had read the documents he had brought with a care that Dwight had seemed to find excessive, had shifted in his chair and looked at his phone twice while she was reading. She had told him she needed to think about it. He had said of course, take all the time you need, and had gone to bed in the room that had been his room through childhood and adolescence and that still had the marks on the door frame where they had measured his height every year until he left for college. She had sat at the kitchen table after he went to bed and looked at the documents. She had gone over them again in the morning. She had called her friend Louise, who had worked in banking for 30 years and whose judgment on financial matters Miriam trusted without qualification, and read her the relevant sections over the phone. Louise had been quiet for a moment after Miriam finished reading and then had said, "Mimi, do not sign this." She had said it with the particular directness of a woman who has seen enough to know when directness is the only useful thing. Miriam had told Dwight no. She had told him at the breakfast table, simply and without elaboration, because she had learned that elaboration gave people things to argue against and she was not interested in an argument. She had said, "I read these documents carefully and I talked to someone I trust and I am not going to sign them." Dwight had looked at her across the table for a moment and then had looked out the window at the backyard and then had said that he understood and that he respected her decision, and she had believed him in the way you believe something that you want to be true because the alternative is something you are not ready to face. He had stayed 3 more weeks. The visit had ended with goodbyes at the front door that were warm enough on the surface that Miriam had allowed herself to think that the matter was settled. He had hugged her. He had told her he loved her. He had driven away in the rented car and she had watched it go from the front step and then gone inside and made herself tea and sat with the azaleas visible through the front window and felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, the particular relief of her house being her own again. The certified letter had arrived 6 weeks later. She had sat with it at the kitchen table for a long time before she opened it. She did not know why she waited. She had an instinct for the weight of things, had developed it over a long life of paying attention, and the weight of this envelope was wrong in the way of something that contains more than paper. She opened it eventually because not opening it was not the kind of woman she was. The letter was from a law firm in Atlanta. It referenced a document that Miriam had not signed, had never seen, and did not recognize. It referenced a transfer of property that had not occurred, could not have occurred, because Miriam had not signed anything, had not appeared before a notary, had not agreed to any transfer of any kind. The letter informed her that pursuant to the legal transfer of the property at this address, she was required to vacate within 60 days. Miriam read the letter 3 times. She read it the 4th time more slowly, paying attention to each sentence the way she paid attention to things that required her full concentration. Then she picked up the phone and called Louise. Louise said, "Mimi, get a lawyer today." Not tomorrow, today. The lawyer Miriam found was a woman named Helen Park who had an office in the county courthouse complex and who had been practicing real estate and estate law for 27 years. She had the manner of someone who has seen considerable human difficulty and has chosen to meet it with focused competence rather than sympathy, which was exactly what Miriam needed and recognized immediately. Miriam sat across from her desk and explained the situation with the same directness she had applied to Dwight at the breakfast table. Helen Park listened without interrupting and took notes in a notebook with the focused economy of someone who is extracting the relevant facts from the account rather than waiting for it to finish. When Miriam was done, Helen Park set down her pen and looked at her. She said, "What you're describing is forgery and fraud." She said it the way Louise had said "do not sign this," which was to say she said it as a fact rather than an opinion. She said, "If what you're telling me is accurate, and I have no reason to think it isn't, your son used a fraudulent document to transfer the deed to your home without your knowledge or consent. This is a crime." Miriam sat with this across the desk from Helen Park in the afternoon light of a law office and felt something she had not expected to feel in that moment, which was not surprise. She had known, she realized, in the way you know things you have not yet allowed yourself to say. She had known since the certified letter. She had known, if she was honest with herself, since she had watched Dwight's rented car go down Calloway Street and told herself she believed him. Helen Park said she would need time to gather the relevant documents, to trace the title transfer through the county records, to establish the chain of what had happened and when. She said Miriam should not attempt to contact Dwight directly while this was under investigation. She said she would be in touch within the week. Miriam drove home. She sat in the driveway of the house on Calloway Street for several minutes. She looked at the azaleas, which were past their spring bloom but still full and green along the front walk, and she thought about the morning she had planted them in 1994 with Gerald beside her and Patrice and Dwight in the yard playing some game that involved a garden hose and considerable noise and a level of mess that had made Gerald laugh his particular laugh, the one that arrived unexpectedly and filled whatever space it was in. She went inside. She made herself dinner. She sat in the living room in the chair that had been Gerald's chair, the one she had never moved, and she looked at the room that had been her life for 38 years and she understood with a clarity that was almost peaceful that she needed to prepare for the possibility that she would have to leave it. She had called Patrice that night. Patrice had driven up from Clarkston the following Saturday, which was 4 hours, and had sat at the kitchen table and listened to the full account without interrupting, which Miriam noted with the particular attention she gave to how people responded to difficult things, because how a person listens when the news is bad tells you more about them than how they listen when it is good. Patrice had asked the right questions and had not cried, which Miriam appreciated, because she herself was not going to cry and it was easier not to when the person across from you was also not crying. Patrice had said, "Mom, come stay with me while this gets sorted out. I have the couch or we can get an air mattress if you want." She had said it simply, the way you offer a thing you are actually offering, not a performance of the offer. Miriam had said she would think about it, which she had, for 3 days, and then had called Patrice and said she would come. She had packed the suitcase and the cardboard box and had walked through the house on Calloway Street room by room. She had stood at the window in the back bedroom, the one that caught the morning light, and had looked at the yard, at the azaleas visible from the corner of the window, at the oak tree that Gerald had planted from a sapling in 1991 and that was now taller than the house. She had touched the door frame in the kitchen where the marks of Dwight's and Patrice's height still showed in pencil, the records of the years of measuring that she had never painted over. She had stood there for a moment and then she had picked up her things and walked out to her car. 11 days on Patrice's couch. 11 days of waking to the particular quality of early morning light in a room that was not hers, in a house that was not hers, with the sounds of someone else's life beginning around her. Patrice's husband Leon was kind and asked no unnecessary questions and had left a key on the kitchen counter on the second day so she would not have to wait for someone to come home. Patrice's daughter Keely was 7 and had taken a solemn interest in Miriam's pearl earrings and had asked permission to try them on and had worn them for an entire afternoon with the serious ceremony of a child who understands that something is precious without knowing exactly why. Miriam had watched Keely in the pearl earrings that afternoon and had felt the compound emotion of love and loss in the particular proportion that the situation produced. Love for the child in front of her and loss for the version of the life in which she would have been hosting this grandchild at the kitchen table on Calloway Street rather than watching it from a couch in someone else's house. She did not allow herself to stay in that feeling too long. She was not a woman who indulged in feelings that had no productive end, had learned this from her mother and from Gerald and from the particular education of a long life that contains more than its share of hard seasons. She moved through the feeling and came out the other side into the place she always came out, which was the question of what to do next. Helen Park had called on the 9th day to say that the investigation was proceeding, that she had identified significant irregularities in the title transfer documentation, that she had engaged a forensic document examiner, and that Miriam should expect a fuller update within the next 2 weeks. She had said it with the measured precision of someone who was being careful not to offer more certainty than the situation warranted. Miriam had thanked her and hung up and sat at Patrice's kitchen table with her second cup of coffee of the morning and looked at the square of sunlight moving across the linoleum and thought about 2 weeks. 2 weeks was manageable. She had managed longer than 2 weeks on less than this. She had her pensions, both of them, the modest combined amount that had been enough when she lived in a paid-off house on Calloway Street and was not enough now, stretched to cover her contribution to Patrice's household expenses, because she was not going to stay somewhere without contributing. It was not how she had been raised and not how she had lived, and she was not going to start at 73. She had her savings, which Gerald's careful habits and her own had accumulated over 40 years into something sufficient for emergencies, which this was. She had her Bible with the loose pages and Gerald's photograph on the end table beside the couch and the pearl earrings in the wooden box and the cardboard box with her papers. She had what she had. She had enough. She told herself this each morning in the particular private ritual of a woman who understands that the frame you put on a situation determines, to a significant degree, what the situation becomes. On the morning of the 12th day, Patrice left for work at 7:15, Leon left at 7:30, and Keely left on the school bus at 8. By 8:15 the house was quiet with the particular quality of a house emptied of its people. The hum of the refrigerator and the sound of a neighbor's dog and the morning moving through the windows at the angle that meant the day would be clear. Miriam had washed her cup in Keely's breakfast bowl and was sitting at the kitchen table with a notepad, making the kind of list she made when she needed to impose order on something shapeless, when the phone rang. The number was a Georgia area code she did not recognize. She almost did not answer. She had been fielding calls since the situation began. Calls from people who had heard through the various channels by which things were heard in a community, calls that required her to explain or update or reassure, and she was tired of those calls in the way that you get tired of retelling a story that has not yet ended. She answered anyway. She always answered. It was a habit she had never broken, the conviction that a ringing phone might be something you needed to know. The voice on the other end was a man's, low and unhurried, the voice of someone who had learned patience through the practice of it rather than through temperament alone. He said, "Mrs. Caldwell, my name is James Elmore. I am an attorney in Atlanta. I represent the estate of Franklin Beaumont Gale. And I need to speak with you about a property." Miriam sat very still. Outside, the neighbor's dog had stopped its noise. The kitchen was quiet with the morning light coming through the window above the sink. She said, "Mr. Elmore, I'm listening." He said he had been attempting to locate her for 6 weeks, that the contact information in the estate records had been out of date, that he had found her through a secondary contact that he would explain in full when they met in person. He said the matter was time-sensitive in ways that required a face-to-face conversation. He said he could be in Clarkston the following morning if she was available. She thought of what had happened with Dwight's plan and with the certified letter and with everything that had come after, and she thought of what Louise had said and what Helen Park had said and what her own judgment had been telling her, and she measured this call against all of that. The voice on the phone was careful and specific. It named the estate. It named her directly without prompting. It made no promises and offered no figures and asked for nothing except a meeting. In her experience of the world, which was considerable, the people who wanted to take something from you came in fast, with figures and urgency and documents already prepared. The people who came to tell you something true came the way this man was coming, with patience and explanation and a willingness to make the drive. She said, "I am available tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. She gave him Patrice's address. She sat for a long moment after she hung up. Then she picked up the phone again and called Louise, because Louise had never once in 40 years of friendship given her bad counsel, and she was not going to stop consulting her now. Louise listened to the account of the call and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Mimi, I looked up James Elmore of Atlanta 2 minutes ago while you were talking. He has a law office on Peachtree Street. He has been practicing for 30 years. He has a bar rating that is about as clean as they come. Whatever he wants to tell you, he is who he says he is." Miriam thanked her. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the quiet morning house. She looked at the square of sunlight on the linoleum, which had moved since she last noticed it, which was the nature of morning light, always moving, always marking how much time has passed since you last paid attention. She thought about a property. The word property, coming from an attorney representing an estate she had never heard of, belonging to a man whose name she could not place. Franklin Beaumont Gale. She turned the name over in her mind the way you turn an object in your hands when you are trying to understand what it is. She could not place it. She had no immediate association, no memory that surfaced at the name. And yet the attorney had her name, had been looking for her for 6 weeks, had found her through channels she did not know. She thought about Gerald, who had known far more people in this world than she had, who had moved through his 41 years of working life with the easy sociability of someone for whom connection was natural and frictionless, who had known people she had never met and had carried friendships that she had only glimpsed from the edges. She thought about the years before she had known him, his life before her that she knew in the outline but not in the full detail. She thought about the things that people carry in their histories that they never quite get around to telling the people who love them, not because they are secrets exactly but because the moment to tell them never arrives in the form you expect, and then the person is gone and the untold things remain. James Elmore arrived at 8:50 the following morning in a dark sedan with Tennessee plates, which she noted because she had expected Georgia plates and the Tennessee plates suggested something about where this matter had its roots. He was a man in his mid-60s, careful in his movements, with reading glasses on a cord around his neck and a leather briefcase that was old enough to have earned its wear. He shook her hand at the door with the contained formality of someone who is professional without being cold. Patrice had offered to stay home from work. Miriam had told her to go. This was her matter and she would handle it with the same attention she had applied to everything in 73 years and she did not need her daughter sitting beside her to do it. Patrice had looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone assessing a decision they disagree with and then had said okay, Mom, and had gone to work, which was the right response and one of the things Miriam appreciated most about her daughter. She led James Elmore to the kitchen table. She made coffee. She set cups down with the unhurried ceremony of a woman who had learned that the quality of your attention at the beginning of a difficult conversation shapes everything that follows. She sat across from him and folded her hands on the table and said, "Mr. Elmore, please tell me everything." He opened the briefcase and set a folder on the table between them. He did not open it yet. He said, "Mrs. Caldwell, what I'm about to tell you will take some time to explain fully, and I want to ask you to hold your questions until I've given you the complete picture. Not because your questions aren't important, but because many of them will be answered if I can tell it in the right order." She said, "Go ahead." Franklin Beaumont Gale, he said, was a man who died 11 weeks ago at the age of 89 in a veterans care facility in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. He had no children. He had no surviving siblings. He had been married once, briefly, in 1961, and the marriage had ended in divorce in 1963 and produced no children. He had lived for the last 40 years in essential solitude, by which I mean he had neighbors and acquaintances and medical providers, but no one he would have called close. He spent 40 years managing a property he had inherited and living quietly on what that property produced and on his veterans' benefits and asking very little of the world. He paused. He looked at her with the careful attention of someone who is about to say the thing that matters. He said, "Mr. Gale left his entire estate to you, Mrs. Caldwell. You specifically. By name, with your date of birth, and with a description that is unmistakably you." The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the street. Miriam said, "I don't know this man." Mr. Elmore nodded as though he had expected this. He said, "He knew your husband." He said, "Gerald Caldwell and Franklin Gale served together in Vietnam in 1968 and 1969. They were in the same unit for 14 months. She sat with this for a moment. She thought about Gerald, about the years before she had known him, about Vietnam, which was a subject he had addressed with the particular economy of someone who had decided what he was willing to carry into his daily life and what he was not. She had known he had served. She had known he had come back changed in ways he never described directly but that lived in him in certain silences and certain nights and a certain quality of attention he paid to things that other people passed over. She had known that the men he had served with were part of him in a way that did not require him to speak about them to be present. She had not known their names. She had not known Franklin Beaumont Gale. She said, "Tell me the rest." Mr. Elmore said that according to the letter Franklin Gale had left with his will, a letter addressed to his attorney and intended to be shared with Miriam at this meeting, Gerald Caldwell had saved his life in February of 1969. Not in a way that was recorded or decorated or officially acknowledged. In the ordinary way that men in those circumstances saved each other's lives, which was by being present and making the right decision in the moment when the decision mattered, and which left the person saved with a debt they had no currency to repay in the circumstances in which they found themselves. Franklin Gale had carried this debt for 55 years. He had tried to find Gerald twice over the decades and had failed to locate him, the ordinary difficulty of finding someone you have lost track of in the years before it was easy to find anyone. He had discovered Gerald's death 4 years ago through an online obituary, a week after the obituary had appeared, and had read it and had sat with the knowledge of it for a long time and had then done the thing he could still do, which was to find Gerald's wife and ensure that she was taken care of. Mr. Elmore opened the folder. He placed a document in front of her. It was a will, or rather the summary of one, with the relevant sections marked. She read the marked sections. She read them carefully the way she read everything that mattered. The estate of Franklin Beaumont Gale. The property in question was described as a parcel of land measuring 42 acres in Hardin County, Tennessee, along the Tennessee River, including all structures thereon, all mineral rights, all timber rights, and all appurtenances. The property had been assessed most recently at a value she had to read twice to be certain she had read correctly. She set the document down. She picked up her coffee cup and held it with both hands the way she held it when she needed something solid to hold. She looked at James Elmore across the table. She said, "Mr. Elmore, I need you to tell me exactly what is on this property." He said, "That is precisely why I wanted to meet in person. There is something on that property that requires explanation. Something that has been locked for a very long time." He reached into the briefcase and set one more item on the table between them. It was a key, old and heavy, the kind made to last, attached to a piece of leather cord that was worn smooth with age. On the key, stamped into the metal in letters small enough that she had to lean forward to read them, was a single word. "Yours." She looked at the key for a long moment. Then she looked up at James Elmore. She said, "When can we go?" They drove to Hardin County on a Thursday morning in a car that smelled of leather and the particular cleanness of a vehicle maintained by someone with orderly habits. James Elmore drove. Miriam sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and watched Tennessee move past the window the way she had always watched landscape from moving vehicles, with the full and unhurried attention of someone who finds the world genuinely interesting and has never stopped finding it so. She had told Patrice the night before. She had sat with her at the kitchen table after Leon and Keely were in bed and had told her the full account of what James Elmore had said and what was in the folder and what the key meant, or what it appeared to mean, because she was careful in her own mind to hold the apparent and the confirmed as separate things until she had seen the property with her own eyes and understood it with her own understanding. Patrice had listened with the focused quiet she had inherited from Gerald and then had said, "Mom, are you all right?" Not about the property, she had clarified, about Daddy. About finding out this thing about him that you didn't know. It was a good question. It was the kind of question that Patrice had always been able to ask, the one that went past the obvious surface of a situation to the thing underneath it that actually needed attending. Miriam had thought about it the way it deserved. She had said, "I am more than all right about it. I am proud of him." And she had meant it in the full measure of the word, proud in the way that you can be proud of someone who is gone, which is a particular kind of pride because it has nowhere to go except inward, nowhere to deliver itself except into the ongoing relationship you carry with a person after they are no longer present to receive it. She had called Louise before she slept and Louise had said nothing for a long moment and then had said, "Mimi, Gerald knew exactly who he was. He just never needed anyone else to know it." Which was exactly right and exactly. Gerald and Miriam had held the phone for a moment after Louise said it without speaking because there was nothing to add to a thing that was already complete. The drive was 3 hours. James Elmore was not a talkative man in the way of someone performing company for the benefit of the passenger, which she appreciated. They spoke when there was something to say and were quiet when there was not, and the quiet was the comfortable kind that exists between people who have no need to fill it. He told her more about Franklin Gale during the first hour. He told it in the measured way he had told everything, selecting what was relevant and leaving out what was not, which was a skill she respected. Franklin Gale had grown up in Hardin County, the son of a man who had worked the river and a mother who had kept a farm that barely sustained itself through the middle years of the 20th century. He had been drafted in 1967 at the age of 23, had served 2 tours, had come home in 1970 to find that his father had died while he was overseas and his mother had sold the original family property to pay the debts his father had left and had moved to Memphis to live with a sister. He had had nothing to come back to. This was the phrase James Elmore used, and it had the weight of something understated. Franklin Gale had come back from 2 years in Vietnam to a county where he had no family and no property and no immediate prospect of either, with whatever a man carries home from 2 years of what those years contained. He had worked. He had saved with the particular discipline of someone who has experienced what it is to have nothing and does not intend to experience it twice. He had bought the 42 acres on the river in 1978, 9 years after he came home, the land that had been left unsold when everything else around it changed hands, the difficult land that no one else had wanted because its access was complicated and its bottom fields flooded and its structures were in a state that discouraged anyone who was looking for something easy. Franklin Gale had not been looking for something easy. He had been looking for something he could build. He had lived there for 40 years. He had cleared the access. He had managed the flooding with drainage work he had designed himself and implemented by hand over several seasons. He had restored the main structure and built the secondary one and had done it all largely alone because he was a man who had returned from the experience of Vietnam with a particular relationship to solitude that he had never quite resolved and that had shaped the 40 years of his life that followed. He had not been unhappy, as far as James Elmore could determine from the account the man had left in his documents and his letter. He had been private. There is a difference, and Franklin Gale had known the difference and had lived on the right side of it. He had never spent the coin he most wanted to spend, James Elmore said. The debt he felt to Gerald Caldwell. He had tried twice to find him and failed and had carried the weight of that unresolved obligation for decades. When he found the obituary he had sat with the knowledge of Gerald's death for a long time and then had understood what he could still do. He could not repay Gerald. But he could ensure that the person Gerald had loved most was protected. He had spent the last 4 years of his life making that possible. He had spent those years, with the methodical patience of a man who had spent 40 years building something from nothing, ensuring that what he had built would go to the right place when he was gone. Miriam looked out the window at the Tennessee River appearing and disappearing through the trees as the road curved beside it. The water was the particular color it gets in October, gray-green and moving with a quality of purpose that rivers have in the fall when the level drops and the current becomes more visible, more insistent. She thought about Gerald at 23 in a country he had not chosen to go to, in circumstances she had never been able to fully imagine because he had never described them and she had never pressed, making a decision in a moment that she would never know the details of, a decision that had saved a man's life and had set in motion a chain of consequence that had arrived, 55 years later, at her on a couch in her daughter's house in Clarkston with a key stamped with the word that belonged to her. She thought about what it meant that she was here because of who Gerald had been. Not because of what he had owned or what he had accumulated or what position he had held in any official accounting of a life's worth. Because of who he had been in a moment when being who you were was the only currency that mattered. She pressed her hand flat against the car window for a moment, a gesture she could not have explained if asked to. Then she folded her hands back in her lap and watched the river. They turned off the main road onto a county road that had the particular quality of a road that is maintained but not improved, the kind of road that has been the same road for decades and intends to remain so. They drove on it for 2 miles and then turned again onto a track that was not quite a road, gravel and packed earth between stands of oak and cedar that grew close enough on either side that the branches overhead almost touched, creating a tunnel effect in the October morning light, the sky visible in a strip above them, the trees close on either side, the sense of moving through something rather than across it. The track opened after perhaps a quarter mile and Miriam saw the property for the first time. She had been preparing herself to see it. She had done this in the car, in the particular internal way she prepared herself for things that were going to be significant, which was to clear a space for the experience by setting aside her expectations and her preconceptions and simply being ready to receive what was there. She had done this, and she had thought she was ready, and she had been wrong in the way you are always somewhat wrong about the first sight of something that is going to matter to you. The land ran from the tree line where they emerged down to the river, which was visible at the bottom of the property as a band of moving gray-green water through the willows that grew along the bank. The land itself was what it was in October, the particular character of a river property in the fall, the fields gone to the last of the season's growth, the trees at their edge of color, the whole thing carrying the specific beauty of a landscape that is moving into its quiet season. The main structure was a house. She had expected something derelict. James Elmore had prepared her with the information that it had been restored and maintained, but the expectation of dereliction had lodged in her despite this because the accumulation of what she had been told about the difficulty of the land and the solitude of the man who had lived here had produced a picture in her mind that the actual house did not match. It was a farmhouse, older in its bones than its surface suggested, 2 stories with a wide porch across the front, board and batten siding painted the white of a color that had been chosen and maintained with care. The porch had been redone, the boards still relatively new, the railings straight. The windows were whole and clean. There was a stone chimney on the east side and a vegetable garden along the south face of the house that had gone to its end-of-season state, the stalks dry, the beds clear, the whole thing having the look of a garden put properly to bed for winter by someone who intended to plant it again in spring and had done the work of that intention before they died. She got out of the car and stood in the October morning and looked at it. The air smelled of the river and of fallen leaves and of the particular quality that rural Tennessee has in October, something clean and cold at the edges and deeply familiar in a way that has nothing to do with whether you have been to this specific place before. James Elmore stood beside her and did not say anything, which was correct. This was a moment for looking, not for commentary. After a time she said, "He kept it well." "He did," James Elmore said. "Right up until he couldn't anymore." He told her, as they walked toward the house, that Franklin Gale had maintained the property himself until 3 years before his death, when his health had made it no longer possible and he had made the arrangements to move to the Veterans Care Facility in Murfreesboro. He had not sold the property or rented it or made any disposition of it in those final years. He had simply locked it and left it and trusted that his legal arrangements would ensure it went where he intended it to go. There was a second structure on the property. She saw it as they came around the south side of the house, a building set back from the main house by perhaps 40 yards, partially obscured by 2 large cedar trees that had grown up close on either side of it, trees that were old enough to have been there when the structure was built or to have been planted deliberately beside it, she could not determine which. The building was stone, or rather its lower half was stone, the upper half board and batten matching the house. It was long and low, longer than it appeared at first because of the cedars, and it had a single door at the near end, heavy wood banded with iron, and no windows on the side facing her. She stopped. She looked at it. "What is that?" she said. Her voice had a quality in it that she recognized, the quality of attention fully arrived. James Elmore said, "That is the structure Mr. Gale specifically described in his instructions to me. He said it was the most important part of the property. He said it would require explanation but that the explanation was inside. He said the key opens it." He paused. "He asked me not to open it myself. He said it was meant to be opened by you." She looked at the building for a long moment. The door was old, the wood darkened with decades of weather but intact, the iron banding showing the particular reddish surface of iron that has been exposed to elements without failing, the kind of ironwork done by someone who knew what lasting meant and built for it. There was a lock in the door, centered, substantial, the kind of lock made to be a lock rather than a formality. She could see from where she stood that it had not been opened in a long time. The keyhole had the settled look of something that has been undisturbed. She reached into her coat pocket and felt the key, the weight of it, the warmth it had taken from her body in the hours since she had been carrying it. She did not take it out yet. She was not ready yet, and she had learned to know the difference between not ready and afraid, and this was the former, the need to take in the full shape of a moment before you change it. "Tell me what you know about it," she said to James Elmore. He said that Franklin Gale had built the structure in 1983, 5 years after he bought the property. Had built it himself over the course of a single summer with materials he had sourced and transported, and worked largely alone. He had built it on the foundation of an older structure that had been there when he bought the land, a smokehouse or a storage building from the earlier history of the property, and had used that foundation as the base for something larger and more deliberate. He had sealed it in the fall of 1987 and had not opened it again after that date. James Elmore knew this because Franklin Gale had documented it, had written in his own records a notation that the structure had been sealed on the 14th of October 1987, and he had kept those records with the same methodical care he had kept everything, and those records were now in the estate file that James Elmore carried in his briefcase. 27 years, Miriam said. He said, yes. Almost exactly 27 years between the sealing and today. She thought about 1987. Gerald had been alive in 1987, working at the plant, coaching Dwight's Little League team, building the raised garden beds along the back fence that had finally produced the tomatoes he had been trying to grow for 3 years. She had been 36 in 1987, had been teaching Patrice to drive that summer on the empty lot behind the Kmart, had been deep in the ordinary abundance of a life that felt permanent because all lives do when they are in the middle of their fullness. She had been 36 years old, and Franklin Gale, a man whose name she had never known, had been sealing a building on a river property in Hardin County, and he had been doing it with her husband's name somewhere in his mind, and a debt he intended to repay, and a faith that the repayment would find its way to where it belonged. She said, "Let's go." They walked to the building. The cedars were close on either side, their branches reaching over the roof, their roots visible where they surfaced near the stone foundation, old roots, the roots of trees that had been in one place long enough to claim it fully. The smell of cedar was strong, the clean sharp green smell of it, mixed with the river smell and the October smell of the morning. She stood at the door. She looked at the lock. She took the key from her pocket. The key was old and heavy in the way of things made to last and used to that weight. She could feel the particular shape of it, the specific engineering of a key cut to fit a specific lock and no other, the ridges and notches of it familiar to her fingers now after the hours of carrying it. She put the key in the lock. It turned. Not easily, not the way a lock turns that is opened every day, but with the particular resistance of something that has been closed for a long time and has settled into its closure, and then with the decisive give of a mechanism that is working correctly, that is doing exactly what it was built to do, that has been waiting through 27 years of seasons for this precise moment, and was made well enough to be ready for it. The lock opened. She lifted the iron bar that crossed the door and set it aside. She put her hand on the door and pushed. The door swung inward on hinges that had been maintained, she noticed this, had been oiled at some point, not recently but not long enough ago that they had seized, the door moving with a deliberateness that suggested Franklin Gale had thought about this moment even in his absence, had thought about the person who would open this door and had made sure the door would open the way a door should open, without difficulty, without drama, simply and completely. She stepped inside. The interior was dark for the first moment after the brightness of the October morning. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. James Elmore stood behind her and did not come in. She was aware of this, of his correctness about the space this moment required, and she was grateful for it. The building was larger inside than it had appeared from outside, longer and deeper, the ceiling high enough that the space did not feel low despite the heavy timber framing that ran across it at intervals. There were no windows, which accounted for the darkness, but there was light, faint and indirect, coming from somewhere above, from openings in the roof she could not immediately locate, the kind of light that fills a space from above without illuminating it directly. As her eyes adjusted, it became sufficient. The floor was stone, the same stone as the foundation, swept clean with the thoroughness of someone who had prepared the space and intended it to be found in a particular condition. There were shelves along both long walls, built-in shelves of heavy timber, full from floor to the ceiling beams with objects she could not yet resolve into specifics in the adjusting light. The center of the space was clear except for a table, heavy, a work table, set precisely in the middle, and on the table a single object covered with a cloth that had once been white and had gone to the particular cream of white fabric kept clean in an enclosed space over many years. She stood and took in the full shape of what she was seeing. She stood with the stillness she brought to things that required it. Then she walked to the shelves and looked at what was on them. The first shelf held tools, old tools, the kind made before planned obsolescence, the kind that were built to last beyond the person who used them and often did. Hand tools, woodworking and metalworking, each one hung or laid with the care of someone who respected what they held, the handles worn smooth with use but sound, the metal surfaces clean and oiled against rust. She recognized some of them from Gerald's workshop, the shapes and purposes of a working life translated into objects that outlasted the work. The second shelf held books. Not a collection assembled for appearance but a working library, the spines facing out in the orderly way of books that are consulted rather than displayed, the titles visible to her as she moved along the shelf, histories and technical manuals and agricultural references, and a row of what appeared to be journals, spines unmarked, a dozen of them at least, the kind of composition books you could buy at any feed store, their covers faded to the particular color of objects kept in a closed space for years. She stopped at the journals. She took one from the shelf. The cover had a date written on it in a careful hand, 1983. She opened it. The handwriting was precise and small, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write in a generation that was taught penmanship as a discipline and who had never lost the habit of it. She read the first page. It was an account. A record, daily and specific, of the work being done on the property, the materials sourced and the work accomplished and the problems encountered and the solutions found, written in the plain language of someone recording facts rather than crafting narrative. The language of a man who was keeping a record because records mattered and because he had learned in some important season of his life that the things not written down have a way of being lost. She put the journal back and moved along the shelf. There were journals for every year from 1978, the year he bought the property, through 2021, the year before his health had required him to leave it. 43 years of daily record in 43 composition books, the full account of a man's life on a piece of ground, the accumulation of 43 years of paying attention to a place and to the work of caring for it. She stood before the full row of journals and felt something she would not have been able to name precisely, some compound of emotion that was not any single feeling but several of them at once, the awe of encountering a life recorded with such completeness, the grief of a man who had lived it in essential solitude, the strange intimacy of standing in the space where a person had worked and built and endured for 40 years. A person she had never known but who had known, all those years, the name of the man she had loved. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She moved to the third shelf. This was where the adjustment in her understanding began, the shift in her comprehension of what she was looking at. The third shelf held paintings. Not framed and hung in the way of art displayed, but stored, stacked carefully in the manner of works being preserved rather than exhibited, each one separated from the next by a layer of clean cloth. She lifted the cloth from the first one. It was an oil painting on canvas, the canvas stretched on a wooden frame, the surface protected by a layer of varnish that had done its work over the years, the colors beneath it still vivid in the way of good oil paint properly maintained, the blues and greens and ochres of a river landscape that she recognized without being able to name, the particular quality of light on moving water in a particular season, rendered with an attention to the truth of it that went beyond competence into something else, something she did not have the vocabulary of the art world to name but that she recognized as the quality of seeing rather than just looking. She lifted the cloth from the next one. Another landscape, different season, the same river. The next. A field in what appeared to be early spring, the particular tentative green of new growth visible in the distance. The next. A farmhouse she recognized as the house she had walked past this morning, painted from the perspective of someone standing where the cedars stood now, painted in a season when the cedars were smaller, younger, the view of the house more open. She counted them as she worked along the shelf, lifting and looking and replacing the cloths with the same care they had been stored with. 17 paintings. All landscapes. All of this property or the river that bordered it, painted across seasons and years with the cumulative effect of a sustained attention, a single sustained act of looking at one place across the full range of its life. She stood at the end of the shelf with her hands at her sides. She said, quietly, to no one in particular or to the building itself or perhaps to Franklin Gale, who had built it and filled it and sealed it and left it for her, she said, "You painted all of this." There was no answer except the particular quality of enclosed air that holds the presence of someone who has been in a space for a long time without being there anymore. She had felt this in the house on Calloway Street when she walked through it on the morning of her leaving. She felt it here. She walked to the table in the center of the space. She stood before the cloth-covered object on it. The cloth was carefully arranged, folded at the edges with a precision that suggested it had been placed deliberately, an intentional concealment rather than simply something thrown over something else. She looked at the shape beneath it, larger than she had expected, larger than a single object, the cloth covering what appeared to be multiple things arranged in a specific configuration. She took the edge of the cloth between her fingers. She lifted it. Beneath the cloth was a wooden box, and it was open, its lid propped against the table's edge, and inside it, arranged with the care of someone who had given considerable thought to what order and arrangement signified, were objects she needed a moment to begin to understand. There were letters. Bound in groups with string, the envelopes yellowed and the handwriting on their faces faded but legible. She could see on the uppermost envelope a name she recognized. Gerald Raymond Caldwell. Her husband's name in a handwriting she did not recognize, written on an envelope addressed to this county and this route number, letters sent to Franklin Gale and kept by him in the specific way of things that matter. There was a photograph. She reached for it. First. It was black and white, the quality of military photographs taken in the field, the paper thick and slightly curled at one edge. Two young men, standing in a landscape she understood to be Vietnam from the quality of the light and the vegetation and the equipment visible at the edges of the frame. She looked at the face on the left, young and squinting against the sun, 23 years old and already carrying in the set of his shoulders something she recognized, the quality she had called Gerald's particular stillness, the quality of a man who is fully present without making a performance of it. She had fallen in love with that quality at a church social in 1976 and she had been in love with it for 41 years and she recognized it in a photograph of a 23-year-old soldier standing in a field in Vietnam. She held the photograph for a long time. She held it the way she had held the key, with both hands, with the full weight of her attention on it, with the particular quality of care reserved for things that are irreplaceable. Beneath the photograph and the letters were documents. She could see the top sheet clearly enough to understand its nature, official documents, land records, the kind of paperwork that describes property and its history and its legal standing in the accumulated language of county registries and title searches. She would need James Elmore to explain them fully and she would ask him to do that, but she could see enough to understand their general shape, and their general shape was this property, this land, this 42 acres on the river. And beneath the documents, arranged in a row along the bottom of the wooden box with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood exactly what they were placing and why, were 8 items wrapped individually in cloth. She unwrapped the first one. It was a small carved figure, river stone, smooth and worn, the kind of carving done by someone who worked with their hands and had found a second use for those hands in quiet seasons. She unwrapped the second. A compass, old, military issue, the kind carried by officers in the field. She unwrapped the third. A knife, folded, the handle bone and worn smooth, the blade quality she could assess even without opening it from the weight and balance of it in her hand. These were Gerald's things. She understood this before she found the note, understood it from the nature of objects and the way they accumulate the identity of the person who owned them, understood it the way she had always understood things about Gerald, through a knowledge that operated below the level of reasoning and had never once been wrong. The note was at the bottom of the box, beneath the wrapped objects. It was written on a single sheet of paper in the same precise small handwriting as the journals, the handwriting of Franklin Beaumont Gale, 73 years old or 80 or 85 or whatever age he had been when he wrote this last thing in this building before he locked the door and left. It said, "Mrs. Caldwell, I have been keeping these things safe for a long time. They came to me because Gerald trusted me with them. He asked me to hold them when he came back home, just in case. He said he did not want to bring certain things into a life he was building. I understood. I kept them. I have kept them all these years with the same care I kept everything else because they were Gerald's, and what was Gerald's was worth keeping. He also told me your name. He told me what you meant to him before he even knew you would mean it, in the way soldiers talk about home when home is the only thing keeping them honest. He said, there is a woman back home named Miriam. He said it the way a man says a thing he is certain of. I never forgot it. These things are yours now. They always were. I was only the one keeping them until you could have them." She stood at the table in the stone building in the October morning with the note in one hand and the photograph of Gerald at 23 in the other, and she felt the compound grief and love of it settle through her, not as something that needed to be resolved or managed, but as what it was, the specific weight of a life fully lived and fully loved and still present in rooms and objects and people, and the kind of faith that a man you never met keeps for 50 years because the person who asked him to was worth keeping faith with. She stood there for a long time. The light from the openings in the roof moved as the morning moved. Outside she could hear the river, faint and continuous, the sound of water that has been moving past this land for longer than anyone living can account for. She thought about Gerald. She thought about him at 23 in that field and at 36 building garden beds in the backyard of the house on Calloway Street and at 62 in the hospital, holding her hand. She thought about who he had been, which was the same person in all of those moments, the person who made the right decision when the decision mattered without requiring anyone to know he had made it. She thought about what it meant to have been loved by that person for 41 years. She thought about what it meant that his love was still here, still reaching, still arriving in new rooms and new mornings, still making things possible that had seemed impossible. She folded the note carefully. She placed it in the inside pocket of her coat, against her chest, where it would stay until she could put it somewhere safe. Then she turned to James Elmore, who was still standing in the doorway with the October light behind him, and she said, I need to understand everything. Starting with the land. He said, I know. Let's sit down. And they did, at the work table in the center of the building Franklin Gale had built and sealed and left for her, with the paintings along the walls and the journals on their shelf and Gerald's things in their box, and James Elmore opened his briefcase and began to explain what she had. James Elmore explained it the way he explained everything, in the right order, with the right weight given to the right things. The 42 acres were hers outright. The title was clean, the estate probated without contest, the transfer completed through proper legal channels with the kind of documentation that does not invite dispute. The land appraised at a value that made Patrice sit down when Miriam called her that evening, and that made Louise go quiet on the phone for a full 10 seconds, which was the longest Miriam had ever known her to be quiet. The paintings were appraised 3 weeks later by a woman from Nashville who drove down with a colleague and spent 4 hours in the stone building with the careful deliberateness of people who understand that what they are looking at requires their full attention. Franklin Gale had been, in the private hours of his 40 years on the river property, a painter of considerable and entirely undocumented talent. The woman from Nashville used the word significant. She used it with the specific restraint of someone who does not use significant lightly and who wants to be precise about what she means. 17 paintings representing 4 decades of a single sustained vision, a complete body of work, the kind of thing that appears rarely and matters when it does. The journals went to a university archive in Knoxville that had been looking, a professor there told Miriam when he called, for exactly this kind of primary document. A complete daily record of a working river property across 4 decades. He said it with the barely contained excitement of a man in the presence of something he had not expected to find in his professional lifetime. She donated them with the condition that they be made accessible to researchers and to anyone who asked. She thought Franklin Gale would have wanted that. She thought he had kept those records because records were meant to survive their keeper. Gerald's things she kept. The photograph went back to the nightstand, beside the one that had been there for 4 years, and now there were 2 photographs of Gerald on the nightstand, one at 69 and one at 23, and she looked at both of them each morning when she woke in the farmhouse on the river property that she had moved into on the 1st of December, 2 weeks after she and James Elmore had sat at the work table and he had explained what she had. She had moved in with 1 suitcase and a cardboard box, the same one she had taken to Patrice's couch, which she understood was the right symmetry without needing to articulate why. Dwight called in November. Helen Park had concluded her investigation by then and the results had been shared with the relevant authorities, and Dwight was facing consequences that were specific and legal and entirely the product of his own choices. He called from Atlanta on a Tuesday evening and she let it ring and listened to the voicemail afterward, in which he said he was sorry and that he had made a terrible mistake and that he hoped she could forgive him. She listened to it twice and then set the phone down on the kitchen counter of the farmhouse and looked out the window at the river, which was running high with the November rains, gray and purposeful in the late afternoon light. She thought about forgiveness, which was not a simple thing and had never been, and which she had never confused with the requirement to pretend that what had happened had not happened. She thought about Dwight at 3 years old in the yard on Calloway Street with the garden hose and Gerald's laugh filling the afternoon. She thought about the marks on the kitchen door frame, his height in pencil every year until he left for college. She thought about who he had been and who he had become and the distance between those 2 things and what had made that distance. She did not call him back. She was not ready to call him back and she was done pretending to be ready for things before she was. She had learned at 73 on a couch in Clarkston that pretending readiness you do not have is a form of dishonesty you cannot afford when the person you are being dishonest with is yourself. She would call him when she was ready. She thought she would be ready eventually. She was not there yet. Patrice came for Christmas with Leon and Keeley. Keeley ran through all the rooms of the farmhouse with the comprehensive investigative energy of a 7-year-old encountering a new space, and then ran down to the river and stood at the bank in her red coat and watched the water with the focused attention of someone encountering something large for the first time. Miriam stood beside her and watched her watch it. Keeley said, "Grandma, is this yours?" Miriam said, "It is." Keeley said, "All of it? Even the river?" Miriam said, "The river belongs to itself. But the land beside it is ours." She had said ours without planning to. She did not correct it. On the morning of the new year, she walked to the stone building alone in the early light, the key in her coat pocket, the river audible from the far end of the property. She unlocked the door and opened it and stood in the space that Franklin Gale had built and sealed and left for her, the space that had held for 27 years the things she had needed and had not known to look for. She stood in it for a long time. She thought about Gerald and Franklin and the February morning in 1969 that she would never know the details of and did not need to. She thought about what it meant to do a thing without needing anyone to know you did it. She thought about roots, the ones visible and the ones below the surface, the ones that hold through the hard seasons with the patience of things that know how to wait. She put her hand on the stone wall. It was cold in the January morning, the cold of something that has been standing in one place long enough to hold the temperature of the season in its bones. She thought, "I come from someone who kept his word." She thought, "I intend to do the same." She left the door open behind her when she walked back to the house. It had been closed long enough. Everything that was meant to be kept had been kept. Everything that was meant to be found had been found. The door would stay open now. That was what she had decided. That was what this was. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.